Magandang umaga sa ating lahat. Good morning. Welcome to the ASEAN Museum Congress 2021. Today, more than 300 museum professionals and stakeholders in Southeast Asia, particularly those from the 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, are gathered to share new knowledge and best practices in museum management, particularly on museum interpretation in the COVID-19 setting. This event was organized by the National Museum of the Philippines in cooperation with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, Philippines. The Congress theme, Museum Interpretation in Times of Disaster, Museum Education, Exhibitions, and Public Programs in the New Normal, emphasizes not only the shared heritage and culture of Southeast Asians, but also the experiences of the museums in the region, especially during the pandemic. This online international conference is an opportunity to increase the accessibility of online programs of ASEAN museums and encourage sharing of education services and engagements that cater to the new normal. During the last decade, universal access and inclusivity have become important guiding principles in crafting museum programs. This conference is itself a manifestation of these principles. As you'll see, the talks in this conference will be played through pre-recorded videos that include subtitles to facilitate understanding of the talks. Moreover, you'd find sign language interpreters to assist those with hearing challenges. We're embedding these means into the conference program, also in line with universal access and inclusivity. For an orderly conduct of our online conference, the participants are reminded of the following. Please rename your Zoom name to the following format. Organization _ your full name. You will be muted upon entering Zoom. This is to keep things organized as we'll have an open forum later in the program. This event is being recorded. We'll be having an open forum later. As such, we encourage you to drop your questions in the chat box, and please indicate for whom the question is. Our moderators will do their best to accommodate all the relevant questions. And lastly, for the participants who wish to receive certificates of attendance, kindly fill out the activity survey form through the link that we'll provide in the chat box after the event. Just a heads up, we'll have a networking session at 7 p.m., wherein you'll have the time to meet and greet your co-participants as well as the speakers. To formally start this 3-day Congress, let's listen to the ASEAN hymn. To welcome us, let's hear a message from Jeremy Barnes, the Director General of the National Museum of the Philippines.
Since participants in this event are attending from different locations and time zones in 3 continents, let me greet everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of the National Museum of the Philippines and our partners in this project, the Philippines National Commission for Culture and the Arts and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I would like to welcome you all to the ASEAN Museum Congress, which is titled Museum Interpretation in Times of Disaster, Museum Education, Exhibitions, and Public Programs in the New Normal. Disaster preparedness has become an integral part of work systems around the world through decades, with nation-states providing legal mechanisms to ensure that this is embedded in our practices, be it in public or in private institutions. But prior to March 2020, We only viewed disaster in terms of those brought about by natural calamities, such as earthquakes and flooding, by accidents such as fires, and by human-induced disasters like wars and armed or violent conflict. For museums and other heritage institutions, therefore, disaster preparedness has been primarily defined in terms of protecting or saving our heritage, historic buildings, heritage sites, and collections in times of such disasters. What we have not really prepared for are pandemics like COVID-19. With the last global pandemic too far back in time, having occurred a century ago, it is obvious that this kind of disaster has not been within our memory. Or perhaps we have become very confident about science and modernity that such a threatening global health situation could ever happen in real life, in this day and age, was inconceivable. As it was, COVID-19 turned out to be catastrophic, that for about a month since March 2020, the world was at a standstill. Beyond health insecurity, this pandemic has brought nations around the world social and economic costs that most of us have never faced before. With the lockdowns, quarantines, and travel restrictions that have immobilized people, paralyzed the tourism industry, together with the closure of museums and heritage sites, all stakeholders and sectors that depend on them have been seriously affected. After the initial shock last year, we in the museum and heritage sectors have been cautiously trying to find our footing and gradually rise, bolstered by our sense of responsibility, but mindful of the safety of our people. We have had to resituate ourselves and our institutions, making adjustments in our programs and directions to adapt to this new concept, which we have come to call the new normal. At the National Museum of the Philippines, we have, like many others, driven to increase our online presence by making leaps in social media content production and in the creation of virtual tours to continue fulfilling our mandate. We have also been bringing museum education to the public through webinars on the one hand, and utilizing some of the time to enhance our personnel's museum professional education on the other. Digital technology has brought us wonders in these tasks. Yet, we have to admit that some existing inequities have become more pronounced or even heightened in this situation, as we witness the same technology being inaccessible to a significant segment of our populace. Thus, the way we interpret and convey information about our collections, access, inclusivity, and sustainability remain as great and continuing challenges that we must also continually work on. We have known where we are weak, but we have also discovered new strengths and potentials that we have begun to tap in order to help us overcome this crisis. Some of us have been in better situations than others. Evidently, state-run heritage institutions like national museums have been buffered by state resources, but coping has been very difficult for many private museums, understandably, given the loss of revenues. Considering such, the challenges brought upon us by COVID-19 necessitate not only individual institutions' responses, rather we need collective action. For the museum and heritage sectors in ASEAN member states, we need to come together for a regional response and cooperation to address these challenges. And for this, we have our regional cultural affinity to build on, the commonalities in our social contexts, and the resources that we can harness and share. This Museum Congress is one big step towards such response and cooperation, gathering museum and heritage practitioners from ASEAN member states online a year and a half through this pandemic, with a few colleagues in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Japan also gracing this conference. We have a lot to learn and share from, including experience, lessons, and best practices in museum management, particularly in museum interpretation amidst the pandemic and the new normal. We at the National Museum of the Philippines are deeply honored for having been given this opportunity to host the ASEAN Museum Congress this year, and we are indebted to the ASEAN Cooperation for this project grant that made this conference possible, as well as to the NCCA for facilitating the processes involved. This occasion does not always come around, but we hope experience from this event will warrant similar opportunities for us to gather together in the future. As everyone will be focused on the talks and discussions these 3 days, I would now like to take this occasion to convey our thanks to our keynote speakers, Dr. Paul Michael Taylor of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, Dr. Christina Krebs of the University of Denver, and Janet T. of the International Council of Museums, Malaysia. I would like to thank our panelists, Her Excellency Minister Sakona Phuong of Cambodia, Dr. J. Aretoke of the Kyoto University, Professor Karen Ching of Singapore, Dr. Estrella Montiang and Patayaraj Tamongsa of Thailand, Titu Huong Nguyen of Vietnam, Dr. Yun Chi Tai of the Leicester University in the United Kingdom, Dr. Ricardo Punzalan of the University of Michigan, and our own Dr. Alicia Magos of the University of the Philippines. My thanks to also go to the 17 paper presenters from Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Vietnam, and the Philippines. To Mr. Jonathan Tan of the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Department, and NCCA Chairman Mr. Arsenio Lisaso, who will give their special messages tomorrow and on Thursday, respectively. And of course, to my own colleague, Dr. Ana Labrador, who is much of the force behind the holding of this Congress, and who serves as the head of the Secretariat, together with our colleagues from the Central and Regional Museums of our National Museum of the Philippines family. And last but not the least, to thank you all, our participants and audience from across ASEAN and beyond. So again, on behalf of the National Museum of the Philippines, thank you and welcome. Apart from the great talks, let us look forward to fruitful discussions in the fora and to reinforcing our network. We wish everyone the most enjoyable 3-day conference that is possible under these conditions in our prevailing crisis. Let us learn together, heal together, and rise together. Again, marami pong salamat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Barnes. Now, to explain further the theme of the ASEAN Museum Congress 2021, let's welcome Dr. Ana Maria Teresa Labrador, the Deputy Director General of the National Museum of the Philippines and the head of the ASEAN Museum Congress Secretariat.
Hello, I'm Ana Labrador. I'm the convener of this ASEAN Museum Congress, and I'm also the Deputy Director General for Museums at the National Museum of the Philippines. Welcome everyone, and I've been given the task to actually give you the notes and themes of this meeting. I always tell our colleagues that this pandemic is a disaster like no other. And that's why we have to look at all these aspects of work that we need to be doing in terms of what has transpired over the last 1.5 years. So the arts and culture heritage sectors, especially museums, have been greatly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything came to a standstill all of a sudden, and the sectors that relied heavily on the promotion of visitor experience, like culture, arts, and tourism, were the worst hit, and we still feel the effects of it. It is already expected that the devastation wrought by this pandemic will linger for years, and it will eventually take its toll on institutions that are not prepared to deal with the change. This also includes our staff, who in varying degrees, are actually experiencing mental and emotional health issues. This project therefore seeks to enhance the museum's versatility, relevance, and sustainability in the face of disasters. In this context, resilience refers to museums' capacity and its versatility to persist, adapt, and transform itself after the disruption of COVID-19. While relevance pertains to the indispensable role it must continue to play, especially in bringing heritage and culture closer to people given the current restrictions and limitations. Lastly, sustainability refers to the museum's long-term social, environmental, and economic sustainable development activities and policies within available resources. So it's handy really to be also discussing the UN's 17 social development goals in this context. This project outlines 4 ways for museums to achieve versatility, relevance, and sustainability. The first is to respond to the increasing demands to make heritage more visible and accessible so that people can still enjoy and engage in cultural activities. We need to also come up with new and creative interpretations of their collections to provide meaningful, hopeful, and healing experiences to people. The third is really to communicate and impart the message of inclusivity, universal access, resilience, thinking, and such other values that encourage a sense of belongingness and continuity. And fourth is to respond to the changing social, cultural, environmental, and economic context with comprehensive long-term goals that are relevant and reflective of society's expectations of museums. Over the next 3 days, we will be discussing quite a number of these issues, and our team decided to divide the themes according to the impact of the pandemic. Perhaps to give a background, the first day will focus really on the pre-pandemic situation and how people actually coped with it. And then on the second day, we wanted to see how these coping mechanisms have actually transformed people and created more progressive programs, no? To ensure that we are actually able to sustain our actions. And the third day will be focusing on how to move forward. We need to have some anchors on how we should be doing this in terms of, for instance, our relationships with each other. And also in the region, it's very, very important that we see each other as partners, as collaborators. And hopefully, beyond this 3-day meeting, we will actually be able to do much more together and to pave the way forward. So I would like to welcome everyone to this very important meeting for our region, and it's going to really focus on museum interpretation in times of disaster, and to look at museum education, exhibitions, and context in what we would like to think is the new normal. So thank you very much, and I hope that we have a good session in the next 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Labrador. Now it's time to meet our speakers. They're all highly regarded and respected in their respective fields or professions, which are all related to heritage work, or even more particularly to museology. This early, we're already expressing our gratitude to them for sharing not only their knowledge, experiences, and expertise with regard to our theme, but more so for sharing their time. Today's keynote speaker is Dr. Paul Michael Taylor, a social anthropologist and a program director, curator, and researcher at the National Museum of Natural History of the Smithsonian Institution. He is the curator for the Asia, Europe, and the Middle East in the Smithsonian's Anthropology Department, and he serves as director of the Smithsonian's Asian Cultural History Program. He's the author or editor of numerous books and scholarly articles on the ethnography, ethnobiology, languages, and art of Asia. He also curated 24 museum exhibitions, including 5 online virtual exhibitions, and produced major online multimedia publications. He's the recipient of numerous international grants and awards. He has served on the board of directors of the Association for Asian Studies and has been a longtime member of the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Heritage Committee. Aside from his Smithsonian position, Paul Taylor served as senior consultant for social and resettlement issues for the World Bank Inspection Panel and as director of ethnographic film development for Essential TV, developing 12 documentary anthropological films. During his studies of rural, social, ecological, and poverty alleviation issues and his work on documentary films, he lived for over 4 years in small tribal or rural villages of Southeast Asia. Friends, let's welcome Dr. Paul Michael Taylor.
Greetings. My name is Paul Michael Taylor. I'm speaking to you from the Smithsonian Institution here in Washington, D.C. Good morning in Manila. And the topic of my paper is the critical role of museums and heritage sites in times of disaster. It's really an honor for me to be here as part of this conference on museum interpretation in times of disaster, museum education, exhibition, and public programs in the new normal, and particularly to open up this first session, which will highlight the role of museums and heritage sites in times of disaster. An overview of what I plan to talk about today, really it's in 4 parts, and we are looking at some of the terrible effects on museums, not dwelling on some of the other horrible effects that we all know, the losses of our loved ones, families, the terrible economic repercussions and so on of the COVID epidemic or pandemic, but focusing directly on museum responses and without in any way denying the terrible tragedies that many individuals and people have felt around the world in our shared experience of this terrible pandemic. We have to also remember the advice that's credited to many people and in many forms. One variant of this was given by Winston Churchill when he worked to form the United Nations after the terrible disasters and crises of World War II. He said that we should not let a serious crisis go to waste. And that's exactly what many of us have been trying to do as we have been recovering in our own particular ways and places and forms from the effects of the pandemic on our museums and discovering that there are some silver linings in this episode and that the new normal that we're moving towards will have changed many things, and some of which will have changed for the better. Our first part is about the museum responses to the COVID pandemic, and I'll use a lot of my own and our experiences here, but I think you'll see that we're all sharing many of these. Secondly, I plan to talk about COVID-19 and the pivot to virtual, which has had many beneficial effects, actually. I suppose we're part of that right now, this conference being done entirely online for many of us. Third, how disaster preparedness is central to the mission and function of museums, and how we have responded to some disasters in the past that have had remarkable effects. And among those responses, of course, is that in the museum functions, one of the purposes of some museums is actually memorializing the victims of disasters. And so that's why I end with this 4th part on the contributions of museums and historic sites to the societal interpretations of disasters and tragedies in the past and present. As far as museum responses to the COVID pandemic, of course, I suppose our experiences here are comparable to those in many parts of the world. This sign that I'm showing you now is taking a picture now of the sign right outside the front door of our museum, right after I had left in March of 2020. A closure that was effective from March of 2020 indefinitely and still has not entirely been lifted, which is to say that we're still not open every day of the week. Most of the museums here are open only part-time and with a lot of changes. A very dramatic, sudden change for a museum that's been open every day except Christmas for many years. If you look at a graph of museum attendance in the United States in 2019 versus 2020. For each of these various museums, you can see the dramatic fall off. And there was more pressure on some museums than others to close down completely. Museums like the Smithsonian, which were very reliant on government funding, could actually survive okay when they were closed down, but many, many museums really could not even make it through the pandemic, and historic sites, and not to mention many businesses and so on. The effects of the closure, however, in the United States at least, were in some ways mitigated because of a large number of government programs. Many countries did this, but ours were unique to the United States, which allowed for people's salaries to continue to be paid, for example, even though they were unable to go to work and their offices and museums and so on were closed down. This was available to nonprofit organizations, and even those people who had to get furloughed were helped more than usual. Contractors and others not normally eligible for unemployment compensation became eligible for special forms of government support. Nevertheless, even with those mitigating programs, the difficulties and the terrible effects on many individuals and institutions cannot be denied. This is a staff furlough sort of pie chart showing the percentage of staff that were currently laid off, and this was in accordance with a survey done by the American Alliance of Museums throughout the United States in July of 2020. So 5% of the respondents furloughed or laid off 100% of their staff, and 35% laid off or furloughed up to 20% of their staff, and so on. So again, I want to mention, because people were furloughed, it doesn't mean they absolutely had nothing to hope for. The furlough, as opposed to termination, really means that you're laid off until the organization is able to begin rehiring again. You don't have to go through a starting all over rehiring process. But it also was during a time when there were special government programs to help those people who were furloughed as a result of the COVID pandemic. So the effects were not as dramatic as if this happened in some other time, because of these special programs due to the extreme closure of the economy, which was seen as in the public interest because of the fact that in a pandemic, you have to keep people separate and by themselves insofar as you can, because of the effort to reduce the spread of the virus in this case. We have a big issue now with crowd management in the new normal. It's one of many things that we have to worry about and think about. And not only crowd management in general, but how are we going to be able to do the kinds of events that are actually extremely valuable to museums. This one that we're seeing here is one that I'm particularly partial to, because it's the grand opening of an exhibit for which I served as curator, Sikh's Legacy of the Punjab. And this opened in 2004. I'll come back to this exhibition also, but it was extremely popular. And I don't know how we could do such an opening now. The exhibit is still traveling, and we're going to be facing this when it starts traveling again, hopefully after this pandemic is over. But of course, the standard events like this were tremendous opportunities for networking. They were really rituals in the anthropological sense. An exhibit opening is a ritual of this kind. I mean, these are events that allow a group of people in a society to celebrate their shared heritage or their shared goals, their shared vision, their community. And this is the first ever exhibition we've done about the Sikhs of India and Pakistan originally. And large Sikh American community was delighted at this. So we are going to be challenged to do events like this in the future. But people are trying in the new normal to create this in various ways. Well, let's look at this example. Of course, I'm speaking to you from Washington, and this is it's a capital city, and so there are embassies from all the countries of the world almost here, and a lot of embassy events at our museum and elsewhere. This one is at the U.S. Institute of Peace. and it's the annual National Day from the Kingdom of Bahrain. This was an invitation from 2019, and a wonderful event. This, just as usual, just hundreds and hundreds of people. A tremendous networking opportunity where we got to see lots of people that we know from the State Department, from the embassies, and so on. Here's the ambassador speaking, and I couldn't resist a photograph with him. I can't think of these kinds of events without remembering the hundreds of wonderful different kinds of dishes. So I just picked two here to show, but just you get the sense this is the kind of event that will be impossible here for a while. 2020 is time to celebrate the National Day of Bahrain again. And invitations went out. Of course, they could invite more people because it now became entirely a virtual celebration. And the video to celebrate the holiday, the National Day in Bahrain, was opened at a particular time of day, 8:30 p.m. Bahrain time. It was not available before then. And you saw a wonderfully made video about Bahrain with welcoming remarks to the event, comments by State Department officials, and so on, hosted by the Embassy of Bahrain. And this is His Excellency the Ambassador also speaking on the video. So I say pluses and minuses. There are many, many more people present at this 2020 event, and we've seen that with conferences and other seminars, webinars, and so on. But the atmosphere was certainly not the same. And of course, you could participate to just sitting at home and eating, soup out of a can or something, because there's no the kind of atmosphere of the reception was just not present. But it was a wonderfully put together video, and it made us all recognize the importance of our friends, and as in every country that does these events here. But we missed a lot of the day-to-day sort of interaction. And I looked back at the 2019 event at the list of business cards that I picked up and the follow-up phone calls and letters and so on. Those were all missing. And I think that this is something that we all face, because a lot of things happen in these museum events. In addition to the sort of economic effects of the not having the large numbers of people arriving in a particular place, you could say that's a savings. And you could also say that it's less visible and memorable presence in the museum environment where many of these events take place. But I just use this as one example. There are other countries that do this kind of celebration, and a lot of those take place in our museums. Let's also talk about the museum experience per se, starting with going into the museum, pre-pandemic entrance to the Louvre in Paris. Now many museums have switched to a socially distanced entrance line, and we see these little footprints everywhere. And I walk downstairs in our museum here, and they're all over the place, even at the staff entrances, and they're all 6 feet apart. That's the rule here, because we don't use the metric system. Then we also have this experience. I mean, people who are socially distanced and walking into a museum and getting their temperature taken and so on, their experience is a little different. They still have that personal, very, very memorable experience of direct contact with the things they're seeing in the museum, the artworks, the scientific specimens, and so on. But what is their real feeling? Does things like this make them feel like they're more safe, or are they being reminded that even being present there, going out of their house, is a bit of a dangerous thing now? And that's a serious matter. And this is one of the reasons that even with the reopenings, the visitation is quite low. Although we do get the sense that once things truly open in a way that everybody feels we can safely go out, there is a tremendous pent-up demand for going out and doing these things, and performances, events, parties, and so on. We do believe that in due course, when this pandemic has reached the stage that statistically pandemics eventually do reach, when people can celebrate the fact that they're down to a low level of risk, that there is going to be a tremendous pent-up demand for going out, just like there is already now showing up a tremendous pent-up demand for going out and buying things that is resulting in some rather serious shortages of material goods and possessions, as well as opportunities to go out to good restaurants and so on. So we have a lot of shortages of goods and shortages of labor now. That is a temporary phenomenon. some of the transformations are quite creative, I would say, because you have to have protection between people to avoid the kind of droplets of either coughing or sneezing or anything like that. But instead of just doing this in a standard plexiglass way, people have come up with creative examples like this. In other cases, in science museums, you have these big shark jaws, that people look through and so on. So you're starting to see some very creative ways of keeping people separate. We also have this phenomenon, in case anybody has the slightest tinge of hypochondria, I'd say this is your moment to be an employee of a museum, because museums are starting to use this, like these health screening questionnaires. And they ask, as the Smithsonian did anyway, before you come to work every day, please give yourself this little questionnaire. Do you have a fever? Have you been, coughing? Do you have any trouble breathing, any shortness of breath, any muscle or body aches? And if you're a lucky person who can 100% of the time say no to all those questions without the slightest bit of doubt, go ahead and get in your car and come to the Smithsonian and stay socially distanced and keep a mask on and so on as you go to your office. But I have to say the offices still are not open full time, and we're trying to keep a low capacity of presence of people in the offices, even now. And I'm speaking now in October of 2021 at the time of this conference. And the Museum of Natural History, where our anthropology is located and where my research program on Asian cultural history is located, is only open 5 days a week out of 7. And the offices are almost entirely empty upstairs in the staff areas every day, while people are teleworking from home. Teleworking from home and our activities during the pandemic period have not been all negative at all. So this is why I'd like to move to talk about not letting a serious disaster or crisis go to waste. Again, with all due concern for the tragedies that many families and so on have experienced, we try to make the best of the situation and find silver linings. So let's look at some of the benefits that the pivot to virtual has brought, and the new revived interest on digitization, imaging, modeling, offsite backups that is associated with our current pivot to virtual, in which even conferences like this one are taking place largely virtually. This is actually in my home. One of my student interns is working with me on a machine learning project, which we might not have been doing if the offices had been open, but everybody was stuck at home. So I invited the interns and the research fellows and so on to just come over and work on projects with me, which was there since none of us were allowed into the museum. And here is the closure sign that I showed before as of March 14th that we had to close. So this was a huge change in our day-to-day operations. I was no exception. Everybody here felt a major change. And there were a lot of people who had difficulties that we had to recognize. And everybody recognized too that all of those of us who have people working with us in our research programs and so on, we had to have a lot of concern for their mental as well as physical health during this time of tremendous adjustment. Ironically, we had just opened an exhibition called Outbreak: Epidemics in a Connected World. And it was an exhibition about epidemics and worldwide pandemics, and looking at how they originate and where they are. And as I had to pack up all the stuff in my office and take cartloads of it down to my car, I had to go through the Outbreak exhibit, and just a little bit of chuckling as I did, but it was a serious matter. And anyway, this is a photograph of one of many trips out to the car. I am with my program assistant, Matthew Arnold. As we were all packing up and taking stuff out, we paused in the Outbreak exhibition, and it had been until that day still open to the public, but in a very reduced way, as is the case still now for our exhibits. This sort of interactive section with a map on where outbreaks of any kind of epidemic or pandemic diseases are occurring in the world at different times. People would be able to touch it and manipulate it and move it around and so on and see the different places and times. we'll forget that. But of course, when the pandemic first started, the first thing that had to close was all the interactives that people would touch, because we couldn't let people touch anything. During this period, of course, all those, it says here, the sign, for your safety, touch-activated interactive exhibits have been turned off. Have fun, and please wash your hands. That was the message. Here we are in March of 2020, rushing to pack up as much as we could to get out of the office, thinking that maybe we'd have to stay home for 2, 3, we didn't want to think about it, but it might even be 4 weeks. And who knew that it was going to be over a year, and then more than a year, and then another year. All our regular meetings had to move online. Here's one of the collections committee meetings in September of 2021. Now, how do you do a collection committee meeting? We managed, but at a time when we can't even actually accession or bring in any collections. So we were considering whether we would accept collections and getting all the information, and sort of accepting tentatively on the grounds that we can't really accept anything because nothing can come into the building, because the building was still closed and the collections were still closed. This is the kind of modification of our normal procedures that everyone had to make. I mentioned this really interesting project with my student, Evan Wainwright. This is my home in Arlington Forest, Virginia. That in the background is the shield from the Korowai tribe of Papua, Western New Guinea, in Eastern Indonesia. I did a film there, and actually that shield shows up in the film, but I ended up bringing it home. And the temporary office that we set up is being used to try a machine learning project based on an important publication of Turkmen carpets in a private collection with good photographs. So we scanned these photographs and tried to create an experiment, a sort of robot or a machine learning experiment where the computer would be fed the information which of these carpets is from the Ersari tribe and which is from the Teke tribe. So it has to figure out from the patterns that it sees what makes a carpet based on its motifs more Ersari and more Teke tribe. And the result, after trying to develop this project, didn't really have any result that was earth-shattering, but it was enough to prove that it could work. That is to say, it looked at a carpet like this that it had never seen before, and you see on the right these figures, with on the left the figure 1, meaning it has a 100% probability, according to this computer, that the carpet is Ersari. And then on the right, it's about 2.27 times 10 to the negative 9 here, which means that it's almost zero, as probability is almost zero, that it could be Teke. But these are the kinds of things that we were able to keep doing. We were able to keep writing, keep publishing, keep working with students, but it was in a very different environment. I'm not sure they all would have happened had it not been for the pandemic. We were looking far and wide for what we could manage. As for interactions with our colleagues, our seminar rooms like this one got closed. We went back to visit the museum, just allowed in for a few hours, in June of 2020 to pick up things to continue teleworking from home and past our conference room, which had so many wonderful seminars. But what did we do in the meantime? We set up a new series of seminars with the Nanyang Technological University's School of Media, Art and Design, especially its Museum Studies program. And this was my talk on Smithsonian in Southeast Asia. We did a series of wonderful talks that were sponsored generously by the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. And the program was called Tidal Currents, Discursive Platform for Museum Studies and Curatorial Practices. My colleague, Professor Laura Miotto at Nanyang Technological University, spearheaded that. Here's Michele Roda's talk about botanical illustrations, the Singapore Botanic Gardens. And we also started another series of seminars with the National Museum in Oman. And this has been supported by the U.S. Embassy in Muscat, Oman. Got a lot of good press for this series on 21st century curatorial practices. This was the presentation by Douglas Mudd, who's the curator and director of the Money Museum in Colorado. And we still have ongoing a really wonderful series of programs. Program series in Japan is called Tuesdays in Tokyo. Never mind that that's actually Monday night here, but it's Tuesdays in Tokyo series. So on Tuesdays, we had these wonderful series. The first one, initial one, was a kind of preview, which wasn't on a Tuesday. Smithsonian in Japan, past, present, and future. And I gave this talk along with Dr. Robert Pancion. Professor Sasaki was the excellent discussant. That's him discussing and posing questions to us. Here is Professor Toru Yamada's talk about the hidden heritage of Christianity in Japan. It was a very sort of hidden religion. It became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in spite of being hidden, essentially. The landscapes themselves were part of the heritage, and this raised many issues about heritage in general. So again, I was the discussant in this case, and that's late at night from my home again, because of the fact that it's a webinar during Tokyo's morning. Here's a seminar with Dr. Robert Pancion, my colleague, is presenting about the history of Japanese collections here in the United States. So this is actually reaching much larger audiences than we ever did reach in that anthropology department seminar room that I showed you that was closed all year. So not only is larger audiences, but we have built-in translations. So for example, in our Oman series, we record them in English. They are translated afterwards into Arabic and rebroadcast throughout the Sultanate. And then the Japanese series is entirely bilingual. I think we need to be doing more of these, and we really wish that we could be doing more of these with all of our Southeast Asian colleagues who are part of this conference. And I just want to plant that idea as part of the new normal directions we could be going. On my International Museum Partnerships playlist, you can see a large number of these that I will show the web address at the end. So you're welcome, or you're all welcome to contact me about these videos and which ones you may be interested in. Third, disaster preparedness. It is central to the mission and function of museums. And I'm going to be talking about this example particularly. August 23rd, 2011. Something that was almost unheard of in the eastern area of the United States, an earthquake. So this was a wall right near my office here that was very damaged by that earthquake that took place. It was 5.8 magnitude earthquake. And our storage cabinets at the Museum Support Center nearby here in Suitland, Maryland, shifted several inches. And because they were exactly on top of each other, and you can see with the cursor here, you can see that they moved and then later had to be placed properly one on top of each other. And in addition, the lowest cabinets were moving around on the floor. Now, this is actually very serious because the ceramics in many ways were damaged. I don't really have time to go through this in a lot of detail, but I will say that when I first arrived as a curator here, having grown up in Los Angeles, one of the things that struck me most was how different things were in storage as well as everywhere else around here in terms of earthquake preparedness. Earthquakes were something that I knew very well from Los Angeles, and everybody was prepared for them. And you didn't find things stored like they were being stored here. And you didn't see things on display that were standing upright, for example, without little wires, invisible plastic wires or something that would hold them in various ways so that they wouldn't fall over if there was a sudden earthquake. But here you never saw that because the earthquakes were almost unheard of, and yet it was geologically possible, as we saw in August of 2011. So this was a big surprise for everybody here. And many objects were damaged, and I had to go through and check all this damage and calculate. I'm curator for Asia, Europe, and Middle East. The damage was almost entirely in the Asian section of the storage, however. So I counted 106 damaged Asian objects, and I actually had to do an estimate of their value, which is something we would never normally have to do for anything except when sending something out on loan. But how can you do this? And I came up with a method of basically dividing them into 3 classes: extremely valuable, of modest value, and replaceable, but still, expensive for us because we had to catalog them and everything. and then just counted how many in each category and multiplied. And I turned that in and said, I don't know how to do a better job of this in a reasonable amount of time. And nobody ever complained. They accepted it. I came up with a value of $895,000 worth of damage only to the objects, not counting anything to the structure of the buildings or anything else. That's just for the Asian objects. Now, my experience with that, we can say it was a bad experience of an earthquake here, is nothing compared to Japan's sort of triple disaster earlier that same year. But Japan is normally well prepared for these things. I would say we were not. And in fact, another anecdote about the Smithsonian earthquake in August of 2011, we did all the normal drills for everything imaginable. We have fire drills here. We have active shooter drills. We have drills for what to do if there's a bomb in the building, if there's a bomb outside the building. Nobody ever did an earthquake drill here because this is not an earthquake zone. We had earthquake drills constantly in Los Angeles when I was growing up. When the earthquake happened in the Natural History Museum, I recognized immediately it was an earthquake. A lot of people didn't, and ducked under my desk. Then the museum didn't know what to do, so they played the automatic loudspeaker announcements for a fire drill, saying everybody should leave the building, which we later knew that was actually not the right thing to do in an earthquake. So people can be unprepared for disasters. Japan is generally very well prepared for disasters. But my goodness, whenever we have some kind of little problem, let's think about March of 2011, a huge earthquake, much, much larger than the 5.8, so over 9 on the Richter scale, and leading to a massive tsunami. I mean, can you imagine waves that are 40 feet high coming at you? Which, of course, not as if that wasn't enough, totally damaged the Fukushima #1 power plant, which is a nuclear power plant having a nuclear meltdown. And all three of those things happened. And so if you ever think you're having a bad day, try to remember what it would have been like to be there, a terrible disaster if there ever was one. Here's Kangoji Temple in Japan. This is one of the museums that was most heavily affected, the Ishinomaki City Museum in Miyagi Prefecture. And I owe these examples largely to the wonderful 2012 article examining these things by Dr. Toru Takahashi. The ground floors of the museum were inundated with rubble, as you see here. Here are people removing rubble from the storage facilities. The contents were largely destroyed, but many things, going through them carefully, could be saved. Here you see people removing salvaged objects that they could salvage from the storage areas. And this brings up one of the real functions of museums in times of disaster, that in addition to protecting our treasured artifacts from disasters, which is part of every museum's mission, we must remember that one of the missions that museums have is to interpret history, memorialize heroes, and memorialize and remember the past. And so the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum is an example of that. It opened in September 2020 in Fukushima Prefecture. It has relics of the disaster on display. At the right, the hands of the clock are frozen at the exact moment of the earthquake. On the left, they're frozen at the moment the tsunami hit. Here, an exhibit displays messages and stories from local residents. These are stories and messages that really honor the victims of the disaster. And that is one of the major functions also of museums, to help society interpret things in the past, but that includes interpreting disasters and tragedies of the past and present. Of course, this example that I'm showing now is from the Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington. As part of our pivot to virtual, I am very pleased that we have been awarded with the in Flanders Field Museum in Ypres, Belgium, a grant from the State Department, U.S. Embassy in Belgium, to collaborate on telling the story of Americans in World War I in this area in Flanders Fields. Flanders Fields and the area around Ypres, the Ypres salient, is where hundreds of thousands of people were killed in trench warfare during World War I. So this is a wonderful museum in Ypres, or it's called in French, Ypres in Belgium, in Flemish, about World War I. So our online collaboration is to sort of unite the various, like the American Cemetery, archival records, and other places that have memorials to American involvement in World War I through phone apps and digital methods of visiting them or planning your visits, getting more information through your apps and on the phone and digitally about background to what you're seeing when you visit them or when you even just visit them online and so on. So that's also filling in a lot of the records of the individual soldiers and identifying the grave sites of Americans that are throughout the area for the descendants of those people today. So basically working together with the In Flanders Fields Museum and an exhibition practice and the development of digital apps and databases and websites that will bring together these historic sites and information about them. So this is part of our pivot to virtual that we probably would not have been doing without this pandemic. And we're memorializing disasters of the past as a result of initiatives undertaken during the present disaster. This is my closing slide, actually. Our exhibition that opened in 2004 here in Washington on Sikhs Legacy of the Punjab. It was a very important exhibition for the Sikhs, as I mentioned early on when I talked about it. But you know, in 2001, September 11th, we had a tragedy, the disaster of the Twin Towers and other 9/11, as we call it, attacks here in the United States. That had a very negative effect to many people, and there was a lot of anti-Sikh and anti-Muslim discrimination. And many Sikhs were sort of being attacked and some were killed. And this was a mistaken identity because Sikhs wear turbans and were somehow identified with the terrorists whom they had nothing to do with, of course. There was a lot of misunderstanding. Some people think that we did this exhibition because of that, so that people would understand the Sikhs. It certainly had the effect of increasing understanding of Sikhs in the United States, not only in Washington, but to the many other states and cities where it traveled. But actually, we started planning it in February of 2000. So it was a series of events culminating in an exhibition opening in 2004. So it wasn't because of this, but at the same time, 9/11 definitely encouraged people to make this probably a bigger and more prominent exhibition than it might have been otherwise. Now we face the issue of continuing to travel it after the pandemic, when people can start planning travel again of the exhibition, which is now in storage. But we're going to have to redesign it. And I think a lot of us are thinking about these redesigns of our exhibitions now, because you need social distancing, you need more room for everything and more room for people to move around and pass each other and have enough room to pass each other with plenty of distance between them and so on. So there's a lot of effort now to plan for the redesign for the current response, the current disasters response, and overcoming the issues that it raises. So this is one of our challenges that's ongoing, something that was really born from one kind of reaction to a disaster that happened. And there's a very positive reaction that we've had by increasing understanding of a minority ethnic group and religion. And we have some challenges ahead of us too. So we're looking forward to starting this travel again. We're looking forward to continuing our work with the Sikh community, with other Southeast Asian communities in the United States and elsewhere. We look forward to international collaborations of the kind that we've seen, the one in Singapore with Nanyang Technological University, many others. So much appreciate the opportunity to join you all here at this conference organized from Manila. I want to mention that you're welcome to download for free any of the publications about these exhibitions or other initiatives I talked about from my websites, as well as see any of the videos. Thanks to the Smithsonian team. And of course, first and foremost, thanks so much to the National Museum of Philippines for giving me this opportunity to join you all at this great occasion. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. We know that you have a lot of questions for Dr. Taylor. He'll join us in the open forum. Please save your questions for later. Before we proceed to the next segment of the program, we'll have a 5-minute break. Let's stretch our bodies and move around. Meantime, enjoy these video presentations.